Hey everybody, and welcome to Arcade 92. We are super excited to show you 3 new games that we have at the arcade for you to come and play. The first one is Crystal Castles. I have been looking for a Crystal Castles for a very long time, and we finally found one, and one in phenomenal condition. Crystal Castles was released in 1983, and if you're not too familiar with the game or ever heard of it, it came out right before the big video game crash in 1983. So if you haven't seen it before, that's probably why. Now that said, you may be familiar with the Atari 2600 that came out a year later. So this may look more familiar to you as the version of the game that you most likely played, since a lot of the arcades went out of business in the late 1983. The game was developed by Franz Lanzinger, and he was actually a tester for Atari. Lanzinger loved the games Centipede and Millipede, and he was really drawn to the rolling ball maneuver, basically what eventually became the computer mouse, and he really thought that was going to be like the future of gaming. So while most of his contemporaries gave him a hard time for not embracing joysticks, he just found that the game was not playable the way he had hoped it to be when using a joystick, so he pushed forward despite all of his peers telling him otherwise, to use a rolling ball instead. Well, one of the great things about Franz Lanzinger that we now know is that when interviewed, he said that he wrote off on his tax return $2,000 in quarters while he was testing other games to help develop his game. He was influenced by many games, including Tempest and Asteroids and many of the other games that existed at the time. Obviously Pac-Man. Essentially the game is a 3D Pac-Man. But if you do the math there, if he wrote off $2,000 in tax write-offs, that's the equivalent of about 8,000 games that he played. So speaking of being influenced by games like Tempest, one of the things he drew from Tempest was the idea that you could do warps. And that idea was really still ahead of its time, but we are all very familiar with it, as warps became part of Super Mario Brothers, so you can make your way through the game pretty quickly. The next game that we got in is Rolling Thunder, and I have been looking for Rolling Thunder for just about as long as I have been looking for Crystal Castles. It was a game that I personally enjoyed and has definitely been on my short list. Now, you may not be too familiar with this game because it came out in 1986. It was produced by Namco as a Japanese company, but it was released here by Atari. Now, that's where things get a little interesting. So in 1986, that was considered the quiet era of the arcades, where a lot of the arcades had gone out of business, so there wasn't a lot of arcades to go to experience the game in its arcade setting, which it was designed for. On the other hand, you may recognize this game from the Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1989, 3 years later. The interesting thing about Tengen is Tengen was an illegal production brought on by Atari. So Atari rebranded themselves as Tengen, and they released these black cartridges. Nintendo, since they were unofficial releases for Nintendo, Nintendo tried many times to sue them, and eventually did win lawsuits. But Tengen had to wrap up pretty shortly after attempting to release unlicensed Nintendo games for the NES. The game is a great game. You follow the idea of an agent. His name is Agent Albatross, and it's so very unique in this way that you could enter doors and you could take cover. The game is so very easily recognizable from its hooded enemies and its long-legged characters that really have so much inspiration from the anime scene. Jumping to the second layer, the second floor, would eventually influence the game Shinobi, and if you've played that game before, you would definitely recognize that maneuver. And an interesting tidbit about this game, too, is that it is considered the grandchild of the game Time Crisis. So Namco is still making today Time Crisis 5, which follows a very similar storyline that Rolling Thunder had created. Okay, and number 3 of our new games that we have for you here is Nibbler. Nibbler was manufactured by a company called Rock-Ola's, and if you haven't heard of them, that's pretty much because they were a one-hit wonder. Now, this was released in 1982, and for the most part, the public was looking at Pac-Man. So if you see similarities from Pac-Man to this game, that is because it was heavily influenced by the popularity of Pac-Man. Although in this one, there is no enemies. In Nibbler, you are your own enemy. As you eat the little pieces as you go around the map, the snake becomes longer to where if you bite your own tail, then you essentially have lost the level. One really unique thing about this game is that it's the first game that we know of to have created a 9-digit score, although it's near impossible to actually achieve a score in the millions, or in the billions in this case. No, sorry, in the high millions. But someone actually has achieved it. So, although his name is very unfortunate to us 90s kids, his name is Timothy McVeigh, and is not the Timothy McVeigh from the Oklahoma City bombings in 1995. That's just a bad coincidence. But Tim McVeigh is in the Guinness Book of World Record for playing this game for 44 hours straight to finally get a 9-digit score. Another great thing about this game for us 90s kids is its legacy in the cell phone games. Generally speaking, it is considered to be the first mobile game to be widely produced. It actually came preloaded on the Nokia 6110 and was also on the Nokia 3310 back in 1997. And this game, you probably have had experience with it playing on an old Nokia if you had one, but this game would lay the groundwork for what would be the giant industry today of cell phone gaming. Okay guys, those are the 3 games we have here at Arcade 92 for you. Come check them out. We are super pumped. We've been looking for these 3 for a long time, and as you know, we are well on the hunt. It's time to play again at Arcade 92.